We have on today a very special guest. Mark MacCarley is at present an attorney and consultant based out of Los Angeles, but most recently he was an active member of the United States Army, having retired at the rank of Major General. A graduate of the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, as well as Loyola Law School, MacCarley holds degrees in business and law. He has held a number of senior commands in the US military, including several deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Kuwait. Most recently, he was the Deputy Chief of Staff of the United States Army Training and Doctrine Command, headquartered at Fort Eustis, Virginia. Mr. MacCarley, thank you very much for coming on.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Let's get down to brass tacks. We first met, I believe it was sometime in the late spring of 2016, when my mentor and boss and your dear friend, the late attorney Vargas Yegayan, and you had just returned from a trip to Armenia. You were both there at a time when there was a flare-up of hostilities between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. That war only lasted a period of 4 days, but you were already able to take the measure of the fighting strength and abilities of Armenian forces. And perhaps I can begin with what one question was, could you please tell us what you and Vargas saw when you guys were there?
Vargas and I went over to Armenia on the 1st of April, 2016. And while there were inklings of possible hostility between the Azeris and Artsakh, at that particular moment, as we were flew into Moscow, and then from Moscow to Yerevan, war had not started. We landed, and what is most interesting to me is that a couple of hours after I checked into our hotel in downtown Yerevan, I received a call, an invitation from the Chief of Staff of the Armenian Army, General Hanyan, and his aide de camp asked me if I would be willing to meet with the chief, with General Hanyan, and discuss the war, or at that time, hostilities that had erupted over the earlier couple of hours. And I immediately said yes. To this day, I can only speculate as to the reasons why I, at that time, retired from the Army for a little less than maybe 18, 19 months, received this invitation. I found myself at what some folks call the Little Pentagon. It's the headquarters of the Armenian Armed Forces. And I met with General Hanyan. It was instant both recognition and, quite frankly, appreciation of his contribution toward ensuring the freedom of the Armenian people as Chief of Staff, and also my admiration for his exploits as a special operator in the early 90s, in 1990-91, when he and a selected band of true heroes assaulted the cliffs outside Sochi, and single-handedly, I don't think he had more than 10, 12 men with him. And it was such a surprise that he ultimately much larger forces, but he spearheaded this effort to assault what was a dug-in Azeri position. And the Azeris fled. And to this day, I think historians, military historians, write that one extraordinary effort really contributed to the thereafter rapidly terminating hostilities between Azerbaijan and the Armenian people of Nagorno-Karabakh at that time. Now, the war, of course, lingered for another 2.5 years, but it was a different war after the successful military assault of General Ohanian. But back to my story, he asked, he had read my biography, my military biography, and in that biography is a story, is my background as a U.S. Army logistician, one of the senior logisticians in the United States Army. It's a skill set that I used when duty assigned to the Iraq-Afghanistan theater of war twice in the period between 2003 and 2000. Well, we're still in Afghanistan, but certainly up through Iraq in 2011. And he asked if I would go to Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, and do an assessment of the logistics capability or logistics in support of the soldiers of Nagorno-Karabakh, and as well those volunteers from Armenia who themselves had found themselves on the front lines combating an assault by the Azeris. So I agreed to do so. I remember one interesting statement, and he said to me, well, you American generals, you always fly to wherever you need to go. And there's some truth to that, because we all had our own chopper, helicopter, so to speak. Really, it wasn't necessarily for comfort. A Black Hawk is not necessarily a limousine, but on the other hand, it gets you here and there quite rapidly, far quicker than taking a military vehicle. But he said, I'm sorry, General McCarley, we just don't have that type of additional airlift. So you're just going to have to take a vehicle. So somehow or another, he or one member of his staff found a Toyota Land Cruiser, and a security element was assigned. And I took that 170 kilometer, maybe it's a little longer than that, road.
And Vargas joined you on that trip too, right?
Vargas joined me on that trip into Nagorno-Karabakh to Stepanakert, and must have been 10, 12 hours trip that under any other circumstances would have taken 2 or 3 hours in much better maintained roads in other parts of Armenia, better maintained roads in Europe. But that was pockmarked not only by weather, but by war. But we arrived safely. We arrived just behind the delegation from OSCE, the Office of Security Cooperation Europe. The vehicle in front of us, I don't think that the ministers, the actual ambassadors from Russia, France, and the US were in that vehicle. Second level managers were, but we arrived right behind OSCE. And once again, after checking in to our hotel, we immediately went out to meet the chief of staff of the Artsakh army. Once again, I established what I felt was a very professional relationship with him. I sort of instantaneously liked him. I should say I instantaneously liked General Ohanian, a true warrior. The chief of staff and I had a conversation, and he provided me with the opportunity to sort of make an assessment, logistics-wise, and as well to visit various parts of his command, which over the next 2 days or so I did. What he was interested in was not an assessment of the morale or the ferocity, aggressiveness, and capabilities of his soldiers, his warfighters. What he was really interested in is whether or not I could provide an answer, or at least suggest a way ahead regarding long-term support, what we call in the military sustainment, logistics over time, so that if his soldiers were this particular war, it must have been the 2nd of April at that time, were to last a couple of weeks or a couple of months or a couple of years, whether he would have, or his army, he as the chief, would be able to support those soldiers on the front line with the necessities of war, such as the intuitively known necessities such as food, water, ammunition, weapons, medical supplies, spare parts, and fortification material like wood and barbed wire and that sort of thing. And so I did that and came back following day and a half. The war, thank goodness, at that time was quite certainly reduced in time, and we'll explain why in just a second. And I came back and I debriefed the chief of staff within about an hour before the Russian president personally arrived in Artsakh to discuss with the chief of staff a proposed truce, which a couple of hours thereafter was accepted by Nagorno-Karabakh, accepted by Armenia, and accepted by Azerbaijan. But my briefing consisted of what I saw in terms of the logistics ability, the ability of the Artsakh army augmented by the Armenian army to support military operations over the long run. And in summary, I can say, this is sort of a paraphrase of what I addressed to the chief. And I said, I've never seen such valiant and courageous fighters. They stood up just as American soldiers do and showed true courage on the battlefield. That said, I saw some things that concerned me as a logistician. For instance, some things very simple, such as field feeding. That doesn't sound terribly interesting, except when you're a soldier and have fought for hours and hours, and there's no food and there's no water. And to talk about demoralizing your courageous soldiers, if those little things that are necessary for all of us, but significantly important for a soldier who is out there on the front lines defending Artsakh, Armenia. And I saw instances in which food was being delivered off the back of civilian vehicles by women, nothing wrong with women, not military women, but it appeared to be women of the immediate villages who cooked meals, thank goodness, and all salutations and commendations to them, and brought those meals to the front lines. And it worked as an interim way of going forward. But over the long term, that indicates a real deficit in the ability of a modern army to conduct modern operations in the 21st century. And as we expand, and I think your questions are going to force me to address some of the challenges that the Armenian Artsakh army faced in this present campaign. And it was really all about a clash of technologies. So I reported to the chief. I told him these are what I saw. Of course, this was, and I have to emphasize, this is very important from a legal perspective, that none of this was done for compensation, not at all. If it were, the only way a retired U.S. Army senior officer could do so is, in fact, if a contract was vetted with both the Department of State and the Department of Defense. So no compensation. Basically, I was identified and did write some articles identified basically as a press, and this is sort of a scholastic military effort on my part as a scholar of military history and military tactics and procedures, and I just shared my observations with the chief. Thereafter, both I wrote articles, I made several speeches. When I returned, I think part of this I provided to you at that restaurant where we often spent quality. Yeah, Phoenicia, quality time discussing global strategy. And I brought these observations to the attention of several well-known, important people within the diaspora out here in Southern California. And as well, I brought them to the attention, certainly of the chief of the Artsakh army. I brought it to the speaker of the Artsakh parliament before I left. I brought it to the attention of the chief, the president, then president. I've got to remember if it was Abramian or Sarkisian, who was the president at that time, and his chief met with me, and I brought forth the same concerns, not about the valor of the soldiers, but once again about technology. And I have to say this, since you are a historian, is that I thought and I opined that the Armenian Artsakh army was sort of stuck in a Soviet, I'm not even saying a Russian, a Soviet model of armed combat that certainly worked well in the Second World War. And we certainly saw it this time, but even back in 2016, the inability to sustain an armed force in a combat zone for over a week really caused me concern. So I suggested that the leaders consider going direct. They'd have to, of course, contact the U.S. Army, the U.S. Military attaché in the embassy, and there's a procedure for doing it at the end of the day, but to consider either adopting formally or informally, with or without U.S. civilian advisors. Remember, I'm emphasizing civilian advisors because there are all sorts of strategic consequences to bringing uniformed military personnel from America into Armenia, either then in 2016, any year thereafter, and even today, because of the relationship between Armenia and Russia. But I said, do it informally, work through Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Defense, Department of State, and there are a whole good number of military civilian contractors who could put what I call those of us who have made that transition from uniforms to golf shirts. And I'm not talking about golf shirts for the purpose of golfing. I'm talking about the shirts that military contractors, so to speak, wear when they find themselves advising governments all over the world. And certainly we have significant numbers of military contractors in Afghanistan. That's a good point of reference. And so I worked on this and tried to get that message out that there had to be a transition, that Armenia Armed Forces had got to move forward from that Soviet model. And of course, my expertise is in logistics, and so I was suggesting new mechanisms for ammunition resupply, appropriate acquisition of certain types of hardware that would give an extra punch to the Artsakh Armenian forces. But like everything, not that my advice has any greater merit than anybody else's, but it appeared this time around that a lot of that had not really been adapted. And as we see in the present, as we do the forensics on the present and the most recent war, most military, both historians and students of military operations are saying essentially the same thing, that number one, there's no better soldier than an Armenian soldier, or soldier from Artsakh, in terms of valor, commitment, dedication, selfless service, all those incredibly important emotional components for a great soldier. But that's one thing. As I think we can paraphrase one general who had a surprising good run for a while, who thought he'd had an empire, and that was Napoleon. And he says that the real folks who win the wars are the logisticians, or the technocrats, so to speak, the cyber warriors, those who operate drones, those who have the farsightedness to acquire cutting edge technologies so that the balance of military capability resides in the country that has made these quantum leaps in accepting the newest technologies. So, that's what has significantly concerned me about what has taken place since September 27th, concluding tentatively, I'll use that word, on November 10th with the agreement by Armenia, Azerbaijan, Artsakh to sign a truce and all sorts of provisions in that truce or agreement that are now the subject of intense controversy and argument in Armenia and frankly around the diaspora. So I could end it there, and then I think your next question will be what I saw about the present campaign. So.
Yeah, I just before we do move to the present war, I have heard that commentary as well that the Armenian armed forces were operating in an army that was based on the Soviet model, but to hear you say bring the comparison to an army that would have been equipped to fight a war from the Second World War was something I had not heard, but it is disconcerting nonetheless. So let us fast forward from 2016 to this year. In what some historians may well call the 44-day war, Azerbaijan, along with its ally Turkey, seem to have pulled off the unthinkable, and that is impose a military solution to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Doubtless, this is a time for many Armenians to ponder and absorb the rapid turn of events that unfolded over the last 2 months, and many questions remain unanswered and presumably will go on unanswered for some time until commissions are established and public or maybe even private hearings with senior political and military officials are held. Unsurprisingly, there is much finger pointing going on right now to account for the immense loss of life on the Armenian side and the territories that have been ceded to Azerbaijan in this November 10th agreement. But let us talk about the military nature of this present war, Mr. McCarley. Could you perhaps tell some of our viewers who may come to this video with a layman's understanding of modern warfare, what's the nature of fighting between these two sides?
The most challenging question, but the question that will be answered preliminarily. We're only 9 days from the conclusion of hostilities, which indeed could have continued under certain circumstances. I go back to my response to your first question about the 2016 conflict, the 5-day war, and my observations about the ability of the Armenian Artsakh forces to sustain combat over a long period of time. A lot of ways to look at the current campaign. Most importantly, you see confirmation, since you're a scholar, I'll use this, of a Clausewitzian, Clausewitz being sort of the philosopher for senior army officers or military officers around the world. And there's a phrase that we repeat, and that is that war is nothing but politics through another means. And this is a classic example of the application of armed force to achieve a political objective. You can hear Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, who said out of his view of things that grown out of frustration for almost 30 years since the conclusion of the conflict in 1994, we, the Azeris, have obtained absolutely nothing by way of a mediated solution facilitated by the Minsk group. So now we're going to take it up and we're going to use force. And we have had a long-term strategy. And I say this, it almost begs a question if in fact Azerbaijan had a long-term strategy to retake Nagorno-Karabakh and went through this rapid equipping to bring it up to 21st century capabilities in a couple of areas like electronics, cyber warfare, and drone warfare. Why that didn't ring a lot of alarms in Armenia. Those alarms being, there's no other reason for Azerbaijan to spend the money that it did over the last couple of years for military hardware, but for one thing. Now, it'd be kind of humorous. Azerbaijan would never attack its neighbor, Russia. That would not happen, nor its other neighbor to the west, contiguous to that parcel of Azerbaijan that is next to Turkey. It would never attack Turkey. That's its patron. So the Armenians, seeing this development and certainly the acquisition of some first-class hardware. Now, I want to go backwards for just a second because you've refreshed my recollection about a conversation I had with a two-star. I remember we just always, generals have a way of looking at their stars. I don't know why. But the chief of intel in the intelligence at the Artsakh army, I was in his office, and what he showed me were photographs, real-time photographs of Israeli drones. Now, this is 2016. Now, they certainly were in no way as sophisticated as the advanced systems that were used by the Azeris in this conflict. But that should have been a red flag because the chief of intelligence, and kudos to him, he brought it forth. And he said, look, these are one of those things, we can combat them now in April 3rd of 2016. But there was no really military reflection, at least as far as I can see, or at least a strategy or doctrine put forth by the Armenian army to combat what essentially became the leading weapon for the Azeris in this emerging conflict. So what you had is you have the Azeris who are taking advantage of multiple opportunities to attack its politics by another means, specifically warfare. And one of the bigger challenges is, of course, that the Azeris had to be, or at least at the outset, were on the defensive, meaning they're defending something. You know, those of us, there are a lot of schools of thought when you talk about armed conflict. I'm of the school that the best defense is an offense, meaning you strike. I'm going to have to tell you this too, since you're a scholar. This is the not only the mantra of American military strategists, and I'm one of them, but equally the Israelis, who believe that the best defense for that very small, challenged geographically nation is to attack, is to go out and go on the offensive. And the reason for that is that you put your enemy into a position where the enemy can be jeopardized. The enemy will lose something. Now, in this instance, you have the Azeris attacking the heroes of Artsakh, the lions of Artsakh, out there defending. But the net consequence of that is either they defend or they retreat. And some commentators have already called this not only the 44-day war, but this is at least the manner in which the Armenian Artsakh forces defended. This was very similar to trench warfare in the First World War. Now, I saw some clips, video clips recently, and these clips at altitude somewhere around 5,000, maybe 7,500 feet, basically give you a pretty clear definition of the trenches that the Armenian Artsakh soldiers dug. Now, these are classic defensive positions. They just like, they're very similar. It hasn't changed over the course of time. You've got sensors in the front, of course, to give early alerts, and you have much more lethal weaponry to defend your trenches, but it's trench warfare. And that means defense. And, this is a historical conversation, but the moment that you get locked in your trenches, you have basically said, that's as far as I'm going to go, and you can never really hurt the enemy. So there's some huge conversation points when you begin to talk about potential strategies that might have or should have been entertained. When I say entertained, I'm not talking about having fun, should have been considered by the Armenian Chief of Staff, the Armenian Ministry of Defense, not my good friend Ohanian, he's retired, but the Ministry of Defense. So we have the Artsakh, the soldiers in these trenches. Now, lo and behold, because the Azeris, with the assistance of Turkey and Israel, outfitted their army, basically upgraded their warfighting capabilities through the acquisition of both electronic warfare systems and drones. And there's a term for this. It's the Turks, look at me, I'm beginning to call the Azeris Turks. Uh-oh, that's across the line. You better scratch that. Maybe that was an inadvertent slip. But the Azeris have adopted to modern times and in effect waged war, as I saw it, through long-range artillery and through drones. And as so many Artsakh Armenian soldiers have reported, it was death from above, not even a whistle. And at 10,000 feet, or what are called the high altitude, the long range drone systems. These drone systems have the ability to launch and release munitions at altitude. And I've seen multiple clips, all of which have been verified, where trench positions held by Artsakh Armenian soldiers were completely destroyed by drones. For the Azeris, this is wonderful because all you're committing to, and most of the time you can retrieve your drones, is you have expended absolutely nothing in terms of human power, human men and women on the front lines attacking. And yet the Artsakh soldier is entombed and was entombed in his or her own trench, blown up, never knew what was coming, indirect fire. And these drones were incredibly successful when you look at some of the most recent, not only body counts, but battle damage assessments of weapon systems that were taken out by the Azeris using drone warfare. It's just incredible. The losses were so significant. Not losses really in terms of ground campaign. Yes, there were some tank battles, but the tank battles were of limited significance. So why this 44-day war is significant. It's significant not only because real lives were sacrificed, it's significant because the aspirations of the Armenian people have been challenged. But equally, for those who study war as a science, this is an actual expression of the value of asymmetric warfare. Symmetric means that you have trench warfare with the Artsakh Armenian soldiers, and 1,000 meters away, you have a trench with the Azeri soldiers, and then they go after each other by crossing no man's land with or without tanks. That is like World War I, but that's symmetric. Everything's exactly the same. The Azeris with Israeli and Turkish weapon systems and Turkish advisors practiced and engaged in armed conflict in an entirely new way that was unanticipated. I'm going to say that 3 times, unanticipated by the Armenian generals. even though, and this is why I retreat to my observations in 2016, the Artsakh chief of staff, and not chief, both the chief of staff and his two-star major general intelligence chief reported that the Azeris were at that time using drones, much more less sophisticated than the ones we have now. But it sort of did not ring that bell, turn on that red light to say we've got to be able to meet this challenge of drone warfare head on. And then the other interesting part that will have to be assessed by scholars, military scholars over time is perhaps if it had been, if the Armenian Artsakh forces had obtained the necessary both drones, necessary ground systems that are now being developed by the Israelis, interestingly, and the US, and of course the Russians, that are anti-drone systems and maintain some of this, it might have been a game changer, or at least it might have altered the outcome. Now, the other, perhaps most controversial analysis, and I mean, this is extremely controversial, is I just raise it as a question, did the Armenian forces hamstring themselves by basically fighting like wars were fought in the First World War with trench warfare? There were some conversations amongst me and some others out here who are interested in these areas, and trying if in fact we were put in the position of the Minister of Defense, for instance, of Armenia, would we have considered a much more aggressive attack? Now, that leads to a lot of discussion, certainly among diplomats, because and some of that relates to, do you bring the war closer to the Azeris so that the Azeris hurt? That's a terrible statement, and I'm any general, any armed man or woman who served in the armed forces around the world is, at the end of the day, a person, a man or woman of peace. But you don't win conflicts unless you strike at what we call the center of gravity within a country that is proposing to wipe you out. And whether that is, once again, you can use the Israelis as a classic example of the understanding of center of gravity, is you destroy everything you can. The Israelis in the Yom Kippur war certainly figured out very quickly that the key to success, two areas. One was to destroy the air forces of Egypt and Syria on the ground before they got up, which the Israelis finally were able to do. And then with U.S. assistance, although undercover assistance with a resupply of, at that time, M1 tanks, were able to attack the Egyptian forces coming across the Sinai at what was akin to a surprise attack. The Israelis initiated the attack, and I'm going to say that the Israelis initiated the attack. Now, again, this is a scholarly conversation, so anything after this, the scholarly conversation in which we are speculating about whether or not the Azeri Armenians could have gone on the offensive. Again, other scholars, those who are a diplomatic inkling, would say, yeah, you're expanding the war. Yeah, the Armenians we know that the Armenian Artsakh are integrated. That's no secret, except it is supposed to be not well expressed because Armenia has yet to acknowledge the nationhood of Artsakh. It has made a calculated political decision that it would jeopardize its relationship with Russia, so it's never accepted the independence or encouraged the independence of Artsakh, even though that was a running conversation for a while among other people. So then you say the only way for Artsakh to really go forward, find this center of gravity, attack those pain points in Azerbaijan, which would have made Azeri losses so significant that Azeri would have backed off, the Azerbaijan army would have backed off, would in fact require the simultaneous engagement of most of the forces of Armenia itself, not just some, but everything. And then, of course, the diplomats would say the moment that you do that, then you introduce all sorts of unanticipated elements. And that would be, do the Turks come to the rescue of their mentees, meaning the Azeris? Does Russia step in? Gets kind of complicated because Russia could say, maybe it will attorn and abide by the terms of its treaty with Azerbaijan, or maybe it would say, if Armenia is the one who initiated this offensive operation into Azerbaijan as an offensive operation to seize more territory, that Russia might back off completely. So there are a lot of open questions, but the Armenian Artsakh were at a disadvantage at the get-go, at the outset. One, because they're defending. Number two, it looked like trench warfare to me. And number three, they had not made the advance, they had not accepted modern technology, which would have made it a much fairer fight.
Thank you. And if I may just pose two questions on this point before we move on. And this was something which was bothering me and many others who were watching these videos, which really were the videos that I was referring to, are the ones that were being released by Azerbaijan's Ministry of Defense, which were showing the camera feeds of these unmanned aerial vehicles striking Armenian armor and armor personnel carriers and troop positions. And we were wondering whatever happened to the Armenian Air Defense Network. And I was wondering if you could just provide us with a brief description of how exactly do these drones operate. So
and you have, it's a different technology because the Armenians are operating or had possession. I'm just looking at a chart that has been widely distributed in terms of the number of air defense systems that have been, surface to air systems that have been taken out, really Armenian air defense systems. They're S-300, not the latest technology for the Russians. I think the Russians are up at S-500, but the 400 scare the heck out of a lot of us. Armenia was left only with S-300 anti-aircraft missile systems.
As well as it's known as the OSA system, which dates, I think, a decade before the S-300s too. These mobile.
Yeah, they definitely have that. That's perhaps the greater number of surface-to-air systems that the Armenians have. So instantaneously, you're talking about some amount of obsolescence. Now, you kind of get into the heads of those in the Armenian Ministry of Defense, and they might have said, well, as they've assessed it, the Azeris didn't have much of an air force. They had some Su-25, so did the Armenians, but nobody anticipated that this would be the type of air-to-ground combat that characterizes the way the Americans fight. So maybe they said to themselves they're willing to take tactical risk and did not, once again, expend the amount of money, although Armenia doesn't have the same sort of financial resources as Azerbaijan, but didn't spend much money at all to upgrade or to encourage the Russians one way or another to give them S-400s. And even if you did have an S-400, those systems are intended for one thing, to take out significant manned aircraft. Whereas drones, the thing about drones, the benefit is you can basically have a whole number of drones because they're relatively inexpensive, especially the systems used by the Turks. And you use different systems. Some of the systems are, at least in the American arsenal now, incorporate some hyper energy systems. High rate of velocity, sort of best description is a Gatling gun. That's an old Civil War term, but essentially the same sort of thinking, that you basically cover a huge amount of area with a lot of shrapnel and take out those systems as quickly as you can. So once again, there was a deficit in thinking. And boy, are there great lessons for military scholars or for military leaders. And that is, you can never rest on your laurels, and you've always got to anticipate that the enemy is smarter than you are, or at least is making some sort of leap in technology that you've got to be prepared for. And for good or for bad, and of course, I will modify my opinions if in fact I really do want to go to Armenia, and if the time is right to interview the leadership for the purpose of writing some papers, if they're willing to do this. I don't know. That's it certainly now is not the right time. There are a lot of recriminations. Nobody wants to admit error because everybody's out there trying to survive, especially in Yerevan right now with a political crisis that's taking place. But for military scholars, I am sure that that the Russians are looking at this. I'm sure that our enemies are looking at this as an example of how, interestingly, America itself could face an opponent who successfully uses drones. We have drones ourselves. We use them for taking out all sorts of terrorists around the world. But use of these drones in what is almost like swarming formations, like a bunch of bees. And, that's a kind of a good example, because if you see 1,000 bees coming at you, you might have you might have a swatter, you might have some spray, but even if you take out 500 bees, there are another 500 that are going to take you down and sting you to death. And so in a lot of ways, that's an expression of asymmetric warfare. That the Azeris didn't have 1,000 drones, but they had a good number of drones. And the wonderful thing about drones from the advantage of the country using them is that you do not lose soldiers or military personnel. You might lose some of those were relatively insignificant, like some of the Turk systems running maybe 400,000, maybe less in terms of cost. So you burn through those, you can burn through quite a few. So a lot of lessons to be learned. But I guess the biggest criticism is there should have been anticipation based upon the lessons that were learned in 2016, but those lessons weren't learned. And what took place is that the ministry continued on its same course of preparation, and quite frankly, didn't keep its eye on the enemy, knowing full well that the enemy was throwing substantial amounts of dollars into advanced weapon systems. And so if you kept your eye, I'm not there, I'm not a member, I should never criticize. I'm just looking at this from an academic perspective, because there are lessons to be learned for American forces and American leadership as well, is if we let our eye off the ball, the enemy might not. And in this instance, if you deem the Azeris the enemy, they certainly didn't. They went to some of the better equipped weapons providers in the world, the Israelis and the Turks, who have their own indigenous military weapons producers, manufacturers. And all along, Aliyev, well, you got to give him credit. He was thinking, he had his strategy, and he held to it. And even if you hate the guy for what he's done to Artsakh, you have to give him credit for being a brilliant strategist.
Yeah. Well, historians occasionally dabble in something called counterfactuals, which means that we'll look at a certain period of history, let's say, and wonder, well, what would have happened if,
yeah, sure,
Hitler had decided to invade the Soviet Union in, let's say, the early spring rather than in the middle of summer or early summer, and what things have changed a little bit differently. Right now, there's a lot of that discourse which is taking place, and I don't want us to go too deep into it, given the fact that this agreement was signed only just over a week ago. And like you said, there's a lot of these recriminations taking place in the Armenian Republic, where many individuals or officials who are trying to disclaim any responsibility for this, what may be called I think fairly as a military fiasco. With all those disclaimers in mind, there are some ideas that, had Armenians declared full mobilization, or had they deployed these ballistic missile systems known as the Iskanders, or the Armenian Air Force, which has a small fleet of Sukhoi 30 fighter interceptors. Well, if these had just been brought into the field, things would have changed. The course of the battle would have shifted. Is there any credence to those theories, or are we just swatting into the air?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've sort of augmented what I said about taking an offensive posture, and how Armenia, yes. Armenia, this was Armenia's war, but no, it wasn't Armenia's war. You have Pashinyan out there. Yes, I'm going to defend Artsakh. We will never surrender a meter of territory. Yet the Armenian army did not put everything into the field. And that would have allowed it to go on offensive operations, to begin to deliver, hate to use this word, but it's the right word, deliver pain to Azerbaijan, to where the Azeris would find that continued participation in this war would severely jeopardize their economy. There are all sorts of scenarios that could be played out in your game with respect to that. But Pashinyan, for reasons, I think it's because of his tenuous relationship with Russia, and the concern, I suppose, there are any number of things you could say. Was Pashinyan too young? Maybe he had no experience in combat operations, all sorts of things. Maybe the Velvet Revolution introduced people into the administration of Armenia that, while great proponents of democracy, were not hardened, what we call realpolitik men and women who understood that democracy and national security have equal significance in any nation. So yeah, a lot of things, there are a couple of things that could be done. And then there, the question, those, I suppose, like most wars, you can almost play backwards. You could say, well, could America have won if it had played harder, fought harder in Vietnam? Well, that's a question that has had any number of scholars, military and civilian military scholars, who have looked at that one over the last 50 years or so and come up with a variety of opinions. Maybe we could have, but the point in all this is we conscientiously, at the highest levels, to include the Secretary of Defense McNamara at the very outset of the war, back technically 65, but they way back in the early 60s, even before Kennedy's assassination, where the decision was made, yeah, America was going to be present. America was going to help its ally. America did not want to lose South Vietnam. Not that this conversation is about South Vietnam, but it was an instance in which the Americans backed off. It said it would not throw the entire muscle of the United States in because it was concerned about China. So you say that about Pashinyan, you can say, yeah, well, he didn't throw the entire muscle of the Armenian army, which has a significantly more robust inventory of weapon systems. It did contribute. I don't want to mislead your readers, because I was up there, at least in the first war, and I saw the vehicles, the tracks going back and forth across the border. That was no big deal. It was fully expected. But Pashinyan did not throw the entirety of his army in there. It had nothing to do, he has no other enemies but Azerbaijan. So I think it had to do with his assessment of political risk with the Russians. And then you can go on and on. Now, this is the other current conversation is, should he have embraced Putin and the Russians much earlier? Did he bring this on himself as the big proponent of the Velvet Revolution and turning to the West? But here's the big question, the multi-billion-dollar question. Even though Pashinyan turned to the West and embraced democratic values and rid the country to some extent of the oligarchs, what did the West do for him? And I don't know. I have to say that. What did the West do for him? I'll leave that. I didn't see any French soldiers in there. I didn't see any American advisors in there. The only NATO advisor was on the other side, and that's the Turkey.
Yeah, I think the response to those who were saying, well, there should have been a greater commitment of resources from the Armenian state was that, well, look at already the devastation that these drones and, as you were saying, the long-range artillery had wrought against the Armenian forces with impunity, and sending more men into the meat grinder may have not necessarily changed anything. But again, I think we have to, this is what I've told many of my friends and others who've asked me about it, I think we have to wait until the dust settles until we can come to any real assessments of what happened and why it did. Let's move on to the question of remedies. We spoke a little bit earlier about the restructuring, at the very least the proposals that you had, that the Armenians could begin with restructuring their military. And this is also to keep in mind, that foreign policy of Armenia right now, I think, is very much in, maybe not so much in flux, but there's many unanswered questions in where the government is going to go there, whether it's going to be led by Pashinyan or his successor is anyone's guess. But if we confine our comments just to the Armenian military, you mentioned better provisioning and supplies. Do you think that conscription, the conscription system in the Armenian military has served it well, or would it be better if it shifted to something on the model of the, in the West, whether it's voluntary enrollment and also the induction of women like the IDF? If you can offer any comments or observations.
Yeah, always a good question. I would say that if, of course, it's inappropriate for me. I'm an outsider. I've not had the opportunity to interview senior leaders in Armenia. Looking forward to an invitation if that were to be extended. But I think in terms of racking and stacking efforts to move ahead, the Armenian army, based upon a new look at the strategy, the worldview of Armenia vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Turkey, vis-a-vis Azerbaijan. And I suppose a driving force will be that there are still parts of Nagorno-Karabakh still technically under Armenian control. And the question is going to be, what's the disposition of that? Or are the Azeris just going to squeeze and say, get the heck out of here, and squeeze with the blind consent of the Russian peacekeepers? So, but once you get your strategy straightened out, you first have to have your strategy, then you have to have a military strategy, and that strategy incorporates an acquisition strategy. So remember that the Azeris were brilliant. They came forth after 2016 with a very aggressive acquisition strategy that transformed their army from a 20th century army to a 21st century army. So Azerbaijan has to, that's what Azerbaijan did. Now Armenia has to, frankly, do the same sort of thing. Now, whether it does it with the assistance of advisors from Western nations, I'm loath to say the United States because of consequences, all sorts of things. If there were American advisors, it'd certainly be the golf shirt advisors, who for all practical purposes, of course, are U.S. Army, Senior Air Force, Senior Marine, Senior Navy, retired personnel, and could embrace more NATO, U.S., strategy, policies, and weapon systems. But to your point, would you enhance the military capability by, for instance, the easier question is bringing in women. And to the extent that the culture of Armenia accepts women as full and equal citizens, you have to give credit for Pashinyan for espousing the view that diversity is a wonderful thing. It's a confirmation of democracy. So if that's the case, you're not going to lose anything by embracing women. It was something I was involved with the U.S. Army, and for all practical purposes, we've seen no deficit in capability. It will work itself out. It's not as it does not degrade your military capabilities. Men or women find themselves in their occupational specialties in the armed forces based upon what they've got inside themselves. So a lot of women who are conscripted into the Israeli army, very few find themselves in the front lines. They can. I've seen heroes. I've been down there a couple of times. There are a lot of parallels, interestingly, that should be studied by the Armenians with respect to Israel and the manner in which Israel mans its forces. But there in Israel, women are driving tanks, but for the most part, a lot of it is administrative sort of stuff. That's okay, they're in uniform. So there's no downside to that suggestion on your part. As to continuation of conscription, that's a hard one. The U.S. went to a volunteer force after Vietnam. It might have been a reaction to the fact that there were so many protests and college students, basically my generation, The baby boomers were all upset because we were drafted and our lives were put on hold, or in some cases extinguished, because we were drafted in the Army, and this was tantamount to involuntary servitude, slavery. That's a terrible term, but some people use that term. It has no comparison to what African Americans went through, but involuntary servitude, maybe that's the appropriate term. And so we adopted the volunteer model, but the only way that works is you got to have a lot of money, because the best kept secret is that members of our armed services, while not getting rich, are paid significantly. I mean, quantums more than what the draftee made in Vietnam, even taking into consideration the greater spending power of $1 in 1968 than that dollar in 2020. So you got to pour a lot of money into your armed services when you go volunteer. There's another thing, which is an area of interest for me, is that a conscripted army does have the benefit of providing an opportunity to develop and inculcate values of patriotism and support for the nation. And we used to find, certainly this was confirmed with the United States in the Second World War, because 12 million American men, for the most part, but some good number of women, joined our armed forces, most of them drafted. And to a man and woman, I think those experiences were life-changing. And in fact, one of the reasons why that generation who fought in the Second World War and lived through as kids the Depression and have the ability to accept hardship is that they learned that in the military. And so there is a benefit, an indirect benefit to Armenia to maintain conscription. But that's my view. I will say as a footnote that some of us retirees in the service are moving forward with what we call national service model in America, in which it's going to be conscription, or our proposal, but not conscription into the armed forces. It could be conscription into a medical service to help a response to a pandemic such as this COVID pandemic, or to help homelessness, or to assist as teachers in impoverished areas or economically disadvantaged areas of our country. Involuntary. So you serve 6 months, you make maybe minimum wage, but you're doing it for your country, but it's mandatory. The Swiss do this, certainly Israelis do this, and the Armenians have. So my personal belief is that I can't speak for Armenia, but I see some advantages to continued conscription.
Thank you. And this is a question which perhaps you may want or may not want to address, but it is the elephant, or rather the bear in the room, and that's Russia's role and now presence in the region. It was the Russians who helped broker this agreement on November 10th. And over the last week or so, we've seen them airlift a massive contingent, including armored personnel carriers, artillery, and even air assets. And what do you make of their presence in the region? Is again, it's contingent on this 5-year plan, which I believe, I may have to look into it again, but I believe that it is subject for renewal, but it can be abrogated by both sides if they decide that the Russians' presence is no longer wanted. But can we evaluate how they are calculating their...
Yeah, and it depends on how deep you want to go into responding to that question of yours, which relates to Russia's aspirations with respect to the Caucasus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Caucasus. Because it's as well known, Armenia and Azerbaijan were republics within the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They were Soviet republics, and in that way, they were linked to the Soviet Union since the 20s, but for a very brief period of time after the First World War, and then they were Soviet republics. So you can see Russia, and if you conclude that Russia is an imperialistic power with hegemonic ambitions, meaning it wants to go out and expand its orbit of power, then everything that took place is absolutely appropriate, because you got an enhanced presence of Russian soldiers in Armenia and in Azerbaijan, but quite frankly, really in Armenia or that part, the Nagorno-Karabakh, that had been occupied and administered by Artsakh. So you have the Russians there. Now, the Russians have always been have never really left Armenia, because even when I was there, I passed by some Russian military facilities, air bases, and the Russians made it quite clear that one of their responsibilities was to provide some level of defense, or at least border protection, between Turkey and Armenia. So the Russians were there. So this is enhanced presence. I think that when everything is said and done and the books are written, I think once again an accolade will be awarded to Putin for strategic brilliance in basically coming in at the exact right moment. I'm not talking about the horrific losses or the tragedy that befell Artsakh and befell indirectly Armenia. I'm just talking about it from military strategy, global strategy. Is he found that exact point in time when he set foot and brokered this truce, which basically has Russia calling the shots right now. You got Russians, you've got at least some of the news reports that are coming out of the occupied territories, or at least protected territories with Russian soldiers, is that the Armenians are embracing the Russian soldiers as peacekeepers, as soldiers who have brought an end to these hostilities. So in terms of public relations, the Russians have triumphed there. And they've also countered by promptly positioning themselves. They've countered an emerging Turkish presence. Turks are requesting the opportunity to serve alongside the Russians. But I think the most recent expression of that from Russia is, okay, yeah, you can serve by us. You're in a compound, but that's in Azerbaijan proper. So we're not going to put you in the Lashin corridor. We're not going to put you in Sochi. You're going to be right where you should have been anyway. You love the Azeris, so you get to stay with them in Azerbaijan.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to contextualize also the Russian moves within what's taken place in Syria and Libya, and not only Russia's moves, but also the Turkey's, and
sure,
how their involvement in these other neighboring countries can be viewed within the same prism. Again, in that telephone conversation you and I had a little more than a week ago, we were talking about how conflicts like the ones that immediately came to mind were the Crimean War of 1856, where Russia faced off the British, the French, and the Ottomans, and ended up losing that war, and also the Japanese in 1904 and 1905, led to these times of significant soul searching. And I think that is what is going to take place over the next foreseeable years in Armenia, and quite possibly in the neighboring countries as well. This has been a very sobering yet enlightening conversation, Mr. MacCarley. I'm certain that many Armenians will be grateful for your incisive commentary and analysis, and thank you very much for coming on, and I guess we'll just see what happens.
All right, my pleasure. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.